In the last days, the Bible tells us a horrible series of events will take place in the lands of Israel and Syria. One of these events is the disappearance of Damascus as one of the premier cities in the world. The oldest continually inhabited city on the planet, Damascus has witnessed at least 5,000 years of human history, and some historians believe the city actually dates back to the 7th millennium BC. In fact, the Apostle Paul was on the road to Damascus when Christ first appeared to him, an event that transformed not only his life, but the course of human history. In the very near future, Damascus will once again play a major role in human events. The prophet Isaiah provides us with God's commentary on a future conflict between Damascus and Israel, and in so doing, he reveals certain prophecies that have been partially fulfilled in the past. However, the ultimate fulfillment of Isaiah 17 remains in the future. The current existence of Damascus, which will one day cease to be a city, as well as the historical absence of the coalition of nations prophesied to attack Israel and be destroyed by God, is proof that Isaiah 17 prophesies events yet future. This is what God revealed to the prophet Isaiah. This message came to me concerning Damascus. Look, Damascus will disappear. It will become a heap of ruins. The cities of Eror will be deserted. Sheep will graze in the streets and lie down unafraid. There will be no one to chase them away. The fortified cities in Israel will also be destroyed, and the power of Damascus will end. The few left in Aram will share the fate of Israel's departed glory, says the Lord Almighty. Isaiah 17, 1-3, New Living Translation. These opening verses paint a bleak picture. The city of Damascus will become a heap of ruins, utterly destroyed. Few, if any, buildings will be left standing. The once great city will be devoid of human life and will become home to every manner of wildlife in the absence of humans to chase them away. According to these verses, the cities of Eror, which are located on the northern bank of the Ammon River, just east of the Dead Sea, will also be deserted. However, the passage doesn't say they will be destroyed in the same manner as Damascus, just that they will be deserted. It may be that people simply flee these cities out of fear. In addition, many of these fortified cities in northern Israel will also be destroyed. The few who remain in Aram, 38 miles south-southeast of Damascus, will share the fate of these northern cities of Israel. Isaiah chapter 17 verses 4-6 paints a vivid description of the magnitude of destruction of northern Israel. He says, "In that day the glory of Israel will be very dim, for poverty will stalk the land. Israel will be abandoned like the grain fields in the valley of Rephaim after the harvest. Only a few of its people will be left, like the stray olives left on the tree after the harvest. Only 2 or 3 remain in the highest branches, 4 or 5 out of the tips of the limbs. Yes, Israel will be stripped bare of people, says the Lord, the God of Israel." The breadth and scope of destruction is clearly illustrated as God describes the Israeli landscape as stripped bare of people. Only a small fraction of people either choose to stay in the land or else survive what is a massive Holocaust, leaving only a few inhabitants who struggle in poverty. Isaiah goes on to say, their largest cities will also be deserted as overgrown thickets. They will become like the cities the Amorites abandoned when the Israelites came here so long ago. Why? Because you have turned from the God who can save you, the rock who can hide you. You may plant the finest imported grapevines, and they may grow so well that they blossom on the very morning you plant them, but you will never pick any grapes from them. Your only harvest will be a load of grief and incurable pain. Isaiah 17, 9-11. What could have caused such destruction? What could have completely annihilated the city of Damascus, killing millions and leaving much of Syria and the northern part of Israel uninhabitable? We'll get to that shortly, but before we do, let's examine the second prophesied event. We'll find this one in the book of Psalms, chapter 83. It's very possible when Syria and northern Israel lie in ruin, the enemies of Israel will see this as an opportunity to invade and to destroy her forever. However, God has a different plan in mind, and He will destroy these invaders Himself. We find a description of this in the book of Isaiah. Look, the armies rush forward like waves thundering toward the shore. But though they roar like breakers on a beach, God will silence them. They will flee like chaff scattered by the wind, or like dust whirling before a storm. In the evening, Israel waits in terror, but by dawn its enemies are dead. This is the just reward of those who plunder and destroy the people of God. Isaiah 17, verses 12 to 14. A more in-depth illustration of this attack is foreseen in Psalm 83. Do not keep silent, O God. Do not hold your peace, and do not be still, O God. For behold, your enemies make a tumult, and those who hate you have lifted up their head. They have taken crafty counsel against your people, and consulted together against your sheltered ones. They have said, Come, and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel will be remembered no more. For they have consulted together with one consent. They form a confederacy against you. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagrites, Gebal, Ammon, and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. Assyria also has joined with them, and they have helped the children of Lot. Psalm 83, 1 through 8. I believe that this Psalm 83 battle will precede the infamous Gog-Magog invasion of Israel, because we know that when they invade Israel, they will be living securely. They are far from secure right now. This condition of security becomes a reality only after the judgments are executed upon the surrounding Psalm 83 nations. The adversaries of Israel who seek to cut the Jews off from being a nation will form their own coalition. Unfortunately for them, they are described in Ezekiel 28, verses 24 to 26 as all those around them who despise them. They are those upon whom God will execute devastating judgments prior to the formation of the Russian-Iranian-led coalition. At the conclusion of Psalm 83, Israel's conquest over the inner circle of the surrounding Arab populations of Palestinians, Syrians, Saudi Arabians, Egyptians, Lebanese, and Jordanians will see Israel's borders enlarged, prosperity increased, and national stature remarkably enhanced. Israel will be living securely. In the future, when Gog and Magog invade Israel, they will be living securely. We find this in the book of Ezekiel chapter 38. No longer will the people of Israel have malicious neighbors who are painful briars and sharp thorns. Then they will know that I am the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. When I gather the people of Israel from the nations where they have been scattered, I will show myself holy among them in the sight of the nations. Then they will live in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob. They will live there in safety and will build houses and plant vineyards. They will live in safety while I inflict punishment on all their neighbors who malign them. Then they will know that I am the Lord their God. Ezekiel 28, verses 24 to 26. All the nations that currently surround Israel hate Israel, and all of them have vowed to wipe Israel off the map. Have you ever wondered why none of the nations that surround Israel, including the Palestinians, are not part of the Gog and Magog invasion? Surprisingly, all those Arab nations around them who despise the Jewish state of Israel are conspicuously absent from the Gog-Magog Russian-Iranian-led coalition, which includes Ethiopia, Libya, and Turkey, along with several modern nations. Prophecy buffs have long wondered why this would be the case, since presently all those Arab nations around them who despise Israel are some of the most vehement enemies of Israel. Could it be that we find the answer to this in Psalm 83, where all those nations are defeated by Israel, most likely before the Gog-Magog invasion of Israel? I believe that a Psalm 83 conflict must happen before there can be a Gog-Magog invasion of Israel. Here's why. Let's examine the prerequisites for Gog-Magog war. 1. Israel must be reestablished as a sovereign Jewish nation. 2. Israel must be living securely without walls, that is, militarily secure. 3. Israel must be living at peace in the Middle East. And 4. Israel must be one of, if not the richest nations on the earth. Ezekiel 38:10-12 tells us that at the time of the advancing Russian-Iranian-led coalition, Israel will be a people who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls. Israel will be a nation at peace in the Middle East. Let's compare the nations that make up the Psalm 83 battle and the Gog-Magog war. The Psalm 83 coalition: tents of Edom, that's descendants of Esau, Palestinian refugees and southern Jordanians. Ishmaelites are the Saudi Arabians. Moab equals Palestinian refugees and central Jordanians. Hagrites equals Egyptians. Gebal equals northern Lebanese. Ammon equals Palestinian refugees and northern Jordanians. Amalek equals Arabs south of Israel. Philistia equals Palestinian refugees and Hamas of the Gaza Strip. The inhabitants of Tyre are Hezbollah and southern Lebanese. Assyria equals Syrians, and perhaps northern Iraqis are included. And children of Lot are Moab and Ammon. Now the Gog-Magog coalition. Magog, Rosh, is Russia and the former Soviet republics. Persia equals Iran. Cush equals Sudan, Ethiopia, and possibly Eritrea. Put equals Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia. Gomer, Meshech, and Tubal equals Turkey, and possibly Germany and Austria. Beth Togarmah equals Turkey, Armenia, and the Turkish-speaking people of Asia Minor and Central Asia. This impending war in the Middle East will be a major and devastating war. The Arab Confederacy of Psalm 83 will be defeated and be destroyed by the army of Israel. Here are 3 of the many scriptures that describe that battle. But the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will sound the battle cry against Rabbah of the Ammonites, Ammon and Jordan. It will become a mound of ruins, and its surrounding villages will be set on fire. Then Israel will drive out those who drove her out, says the Lord. Jeremiah 49, verse 2. Turn and flee, hide in deep caves, you who live in Dedan, Saudi Arabia, for I will bring disaster on Esau at the time I punish him, southern Jordan. Jeremiah 49, verse 8. Like a lion, the confederacy of Esau, coming up from Jordan's thickets to a rich pasture land, Israel, I will chase Edom from its lands in an instant. Who is the chosen one I will appoint for this? Who is like me, and who can challenge me? And what shepherd can stand against me? Jeremiah 49, verse 19. Israel's borders expand, the new Middle East. The Bible tells us that as a result of this massive military victory given to Israel from God, the face of the Middle East will drastically change. Israel will significantly increase in size. The tiny nation of Israel, as we currently know it, will soon encompass a major portion of the Middle East. The nations that form this Arab coalition fall, for the most part, within the scope of land from the covenant that God made with Abraham. At the end of this war, Israel's borders will reset to that of, or very close to, the borders that God established for Israel in a covenant with Abraham. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I have given this land, from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates." Genesis 15:18. The south shall possess the mountains of Esau, southern Jordan, And the lowland shall possess Philistia, the Gaza Strip. They shall possess the fields of Ephraim and the fields of Samaria, the West Bank. Benjamin shall possess Gilead, West Bank and Golan Heights. Obadiah 1:19. The Negev will possess southern Jordan. The lowland of Judah will possess the Gaza Strip and the southern parts of the West Bank. Northern Israel will possess the northern part of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, much of northern Jordan, and southern Syria. Therefore, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will cause to be heard an alarm of war in Rabbah of the Ammonites. It shall be a desolate mound, and her villages shall be burned with fire. Then Israel shall take possession of his inheritance, says the Lord. Jeremiah 49, verse 2. Much of modern-day Jordan was once part of the inheritance of Israel. The tribes of East Manasseh, Benjamin, Gad, and Reuben once possessed land that is presently under Jordanian sovereignty, but this land will soon pass back to its rightful owner. In that day, 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear by the Lord of hosts. One will be called the City of Destruction. In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. Isaiah 19, verses 18 and 19. Isaiah tells us that the expansion of Israeli sovereignty in the region will even reach into Egypt to some degree. 5 Hebrew-speaking cities will be established in the land of Egypt. There will be an altar erected to God, as well as a pillar erected to God on the border. Israel will be elevated to a condition of regional superiority due to their decisive victory over the Arab Confederacy. As such, they dwell securely in the Middle East for a time. The world will freak out. At the sound of their fall, the earth will tremble. Their cry will resound to the Red Sea. Jeremiah 49:21. Jeremiah says the earth shakes at the sound of their fall. This shows the magnitude of the effect that this war will have on the international community. The Hebrew word used here is rash, which expresses the trembling experienced during a devastating earthquake and its aftershock. Isaiah 17, verses 12 and 13 describes it this way. O the raging of many nations! They rage like the raging sea. O the uproar of the peoples! They roar like the roaring of great waters. Although the peoples roar like the roar of surging waters, when he rebukes them, they flee far away, driven before the wind like chaff on the hills, like tumbleweed before a gale. If Israel finds themselves backed into a corner and feels that the only way to protect themselves is to take out Damascus, then they might use the Samson option. The Samson option refers to the nuclear strategy whereby Israel would launch a massive nuclear retaliatory strike if the state itself was being overran, just as the biblical figure Samson pushed apart the pillars of a Philistine temple, bringing down the roof and killing himself and thousands of Philistines who had gathered to see him humiliated. A nuclear bomb would obliterate Damascus and the surrounding area, making it uninhabitable, just as the Bible describes in Isaiah 17. We know this can happen, as history has shown us with the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. With Israel reeling from having to use the Samson option, the Psalm 83 coalition of nations will see this as their opportunity to finally take Israel out. Of course, God has other plans and gives Israel victory over this invading horde. This would give Israel control over much of the oil in the Middle East and make them one of the world's richest nations. With all the land they captured, it would finally give this tiny nation enough space to protect themselves, so they can live securely. Russia and Iran will not let Israel enjoy this victory and their newfound wealth for very long. Russia, with its huge Muslim population, along with Israel's archenemy Iran, will lead the Gog-Magog coalition in invading Israel, fulfilling Ezekiel 38. A wealthy oil field controlling Israel might be the hooks in the jaw that cause Russia to invade Israel, Unfortunately for Russia, Iran, and the rest of the coalition, God will intervene, protecting Israel and wiping out 6/7 of the entire Russian military. Everything we see developing is a sure sign that the tribulation period is fast approaching. The Bible teaches that the Lord will come to snatch up or rapture His bride, the church, out of harm's way before this tribulation begins. So if these tribulation events are close, then the rapture of the church must be nearer. Are you ready?